There, Ezekiel here. She is not shy, and she is certainly not retiring anytime soon, apparently. I am, of course, referring to Lady Hortensia, Crawfish Dunn. Double M! Just as I was beginning to think that the Prigozhin incident would probably be my last hurrah before shuffling off this mortal coil, did I mention I'm 102? I found myself recently, and rather bizarrely, in a court of law on quite serious charges, merely for getting into the spirit of the season. I will explain. The build-up to the season was rather hectic, and I'd given the gardener the task of cutting Christmas trees for the house, and you know how he loves cutting down trees. I decided to give him a few extra days off before Christmas, as he'd been rather tetchy since the Prigozhin incident and was quite frankly getting on my nerves. I waved him off on the Friday evening and was just looking forward to an early night in my favourite chair with a hot chocolate beverage and a good book, when I thought I heard what sounded like an elephant seal being castrated on my front doorstep. It was carolers at the door. They sounded dreadful, as they do. I thought, I suppose I better get into the spirit of things and let them in. If only I'd known. I opened the door and they more or less fell in. 4 men, wearing bobble hats and scarves over their faces, and a rather scantily clad young woman in a very short skirt and a strappy top, which was backless. Good Lord, I said, you'll catch your death, dear, do come in. Go on into the kitchen. You can all get warm by the hour and perform from in there. The largest of the males introduced himself as Degsy and said that the kitchen looked like the perfect place for them to pattern up and prep in. Good Lord, I thought, they're taking this caroling lark rather seriously. I noticed that the other men didn't really speak much and that they all had identical small holdalls over their shoulders. Probably for collecting presents in, I thought. How adorable. And then Degsy said that the kitchen was to become their trap yard. Trap yard, I said. Our crib, Ma. And that they would like to do some cooking for the local nitties. A crib, I replied. How festive. Can't say I've heard of the nitties, though. Are they local? Degsy said that some would be local, Ma, and some from out of town. To be honest, I was somewhat relieved that they decided to do something a little more creative, as their singing was pretty awful. All of a sudden, as one, they gathered around the peninsula in my kitchen, and each of the men produced a small set of weighing scales from their holdalls, and what looked like packs of sugar and white flour, which they began mixing and putting into small packets. They'd obviously come prepared. It was like being in the middle of that bake-off programme on the TV. It was a little too obsessive for me. All the weighing and re-weighing. It was a little too, Heston Blumenthal for my liking. More like a chemistry lesson than a bake-off. I'm more of a Delia girl myself. I just chuck stuff in and hope for the best. As I watched them working away, I thought to myself, the youngsters today are so inspirational and utterly selfless, coming out on this freezing cold night to sing carols and bake for the local nitties. It may have been the time of year, but I was rather moved by that thought. Would anyone like a coffee, I asked. That would be great, Ma, Degsy said. I was rather warming to Degsy. I loved the way he called me Ma. The young girl offered to help with the coffees, She was rather thin but quite sweet. Her name was Tina, and she seemed to be Degsy's girlfriend. I asked her if they would like some nibbles to go with the coffee, and she seemed really pleased with that suggestion. So I brought out some biscuits and peanuts and crisps, which she enthusiastically set about eating. I asked if she'd brought any presents for Degsy so far, and she whispered that she was getting a Bolivian, and that was one of his presents. I have no idea what that is. At least I thought she said a Bolivian. Before long, we were on our second coffee. I don't know where Tina had put all the snacks, as she was as thin as a rail. Despite that, she seemed to have eaten almost everything. She asked if I had any more left. Oh, I'm afraid that's a lot, dear. I will have to go for an early morning shop tomorrow. The local constabulary will be arriving at 11:30 for their Christmas lunch. She looked at me rather oddly. Constabulary, she said. What? Like the Jakeses? I don't know any Jakeses, dear, I said. I mean the local police. They come every year. There'll only be half a dozen of them. It's a tradition. We've done it since Granny's day. But they will need some snacks too, won't they? Tina quickly went over to Degsy and whispered in his ear. They both looked over at me, rather conspiratorially, I thought. Degsy announced that the Jakeses were coming, and it was time to get busy. Phones out, lads! Suddenly the whole kitchen had changed from bake-off to what sounded like one of those dreadful call centres where they put you on hold for an eternity. Everyone talking and texting on their phones. Tina was constantly harping on about the Jakeses coming. I was still waiting for the knitters to arrive. To be honest, I was beginning to regret ever letting them in, as they'd been cooking for almost 3 hours, and no one had yet started on the crib. Degsy came over and asked if I would like to try the small cakes that they'd been making. Oh, just the one, I said. I don't wish to deprive the knitters. I didn't like to say, but it tasted awful. I washed it down with some coffee and a few crisps that Tina had evidently missed. Suddenly, the doorbell rang and Degsy said, "That will be the knitters." "Oh, it's rather late," I said. "Shall I open the door?" "Tina will go with you," he replied. I thought that was rather odd. They probably thought I didn't know the way to my own front door. The first of the knitters was a sallow-looking young man who seemed rather nervous. Tina gave him one of the tiny cakes, and he gave her a £10 note for that little thing. That's nouvelle cuisine for you. Granny used to say that nouvelle cuisine was French for not enough. And Granny was never wrong. Suddenly, things started to feel a little strange. It was as though I'd got a second wind, and things seemed somewhat heightened. The knitters were arriving every few minutes. It was all rather odd. There were dozens of them, but strangely, there seemed to be no discernible familial link. They were all shapes and sizes. The only thing they seemed to have in common was a certain nervous disposition on arrival and no apparent desire to come in. It did, however, give one a warm, fuzzy feeling, as we were clearly making so much money for good causes. We were backwards and forwards to the door. Suddenly, I began to feel a little tired and felt the need to have a lie on the chaise in the hallway. And then things seemed to get very Alice in Wonderland. I don't know if I dreamt this, but I can remember what appeared to be strange blue, flashing lights everywhere, and people were running up and down the hallway. Then a large dog seemed to be barking in my face. It was rather scary, as more and more people seemed to have arrived. I remember two strange men in green uniforms lifting me up and putting me on some kind of stretcher, then trying to carry me towards a vehicle. Good God, I thought, I'm being abducted. And I leapt, at my age, off the stretcher and ran back towards the house. To no avail. I remember seeing Degsy and the boys coming out of the house towards me. They were being abducted too. As they passed me, Degsy cried, "Merry Crystal Meth, Ma!" Bless him. Then I was grabbed again and struggled to resist whilst they strapped me to the stretcher. And then it went dark. I must have passed out. I woke up in hospital with a terrible headache and upset stomach. I rather suspected that Blumenthal's cake had something to do with that. And talking of cake, I think it's time for a little snack break, don't you? Go on, off you go. I will be back shortly to finish my tale. Now, where did I put those crisps?